listening to the bipartisan calls to submit to the constitutional authority of Congress. That was significant. It was the right thing to do, and I'm glad he did so. And secondly, once the issue came to Congress, that gave the American people a chance to speak up. I'll tell you, I've spent the last 6 weeks traveling the state of Texas, doing town halls, doing roundtables all over the state. It did not matter where in Texas you were. East Texas, West Texas, the Panhandle, down in the Rio Grande Valley. There was almost total unanimity that the United States had no business getting in the middle of a sectarian civil war in Syria. You know, I tell you, our office in the last few weeks has had over 5,000 calls opposing military intervention in Syria. We had roughly 50 in support of it. In fact, the percentage, I believe, was 99.13% of the calls opposed military intervention. Now, how would you apply those principles to Syria? Because I think the president's approach managed to violate all three. Let's start with moral clarity. Everyone acknowledges Assad is a brutal tyrant. He has murdered over 100,000 of his citizens. He has displaced millions as refugees. And he's used chemical weapons to gas some 1,400 innocent civilians, including over 400 children. The man is a monster, and he should be universally condemned for doing so. But the principle that U.S. foreign policy, and in particular the use of military force, should key and depend upon U.S. national security. If you listen to President Obama, if you listen to Secretary Kerry's arguments for launching a military strike against Syria, they primarily derive from the need to defend a, quote, international norm, and to send a statement in defense of that international norm. Now, I'm going to suggest to you it is not the job of the men and women of our military to send statements about international norms. It is the job of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines to stand up and defend the United States of America, to kill our enemies, and to defend our national security. The objective, the president's objective in Syria was fundamentally wrong because it was directed at this international norm. And that, in turn, the third principle I laid out about always fight to win. Well, if your objective is sending a statement, you're not winning or losing. I mean, a statement is fundamentally a press release. A statement is something that is quite welcome in a university faculty lounge, but is not the appropriate focus of the U.S. military. And so, accordingly, we were told by the Secretary of State that our statement, our military response, if it happened, would be unbelievably small. Now, if one were endeavoring to always fight to win, an unbelievably small response would, on its face, be insufficient to do that. But there was no winning. Winning was not the objective. It was simply making a statement in defense of international norms. But not only was the proposed military intervention not, I believe, in defense of U.S. national security, it posed a grave risk of undermining U.S. national security. Why is that? Because even though Assad is a brutal, murderous thug, that doesn't mean his opponents are any better. As of June, of the 9 major rebel groups, up to 7 of them appear to have had significant ties to Al-Qaeda. And if the president's unbelievably tiny and yet somehow not a pinprick attack were actually successful in undermining and weakening the Assad regime, the predictable effect of that could well be enabling the Al-Qaeda, the Al-Nusra, Islamic radicals to seize control of that government, and even more worrisome, to seize control of those vast cache of chemical weapons. And I got to tell you, if radical Islamic terrorists seize control of chemical weapons, that poses a grave threat to U.S. national security. And yet, going back to what we were talking about before with respect to Al-Qaeda, with respect to 9/11, with respect to Fort Hood, if the administration is not focused on fighting radical Islamic terrorism, it is likewise not appropriately focused on the grave danger of preventing terrorists from acquiring those weapons, because if Al-Qaeda gets control of those weapons, it is not a leap of the imagination that those chemical weapons would be used to murder thousands or millions of Americans or our allies. The focus was ill-directed. Now, that I would have and still will vote against military force in Syria does not mean that we should do nothing. There are a host of options we can engage in proactively to condemn Assad's murder. Number one, there have been reports that Iraq has been allowing Iran to fly over their airspace and resupply Assad. In my view, we should immediately cancel the $500 million in aid we are sending to Iraq unless and until they cut off air rights for Iran to resupply Assad. Now, that's a simple, direct response that goes directly to Assad. It also goes to Iran, and it is focused on our U.S. national security interests. Beyond that, in my view, the United States should force a vote in the UN Security Council condemning Assad's atrocities. Now, Russia and China will almost surely object. But in my view, we should force them to do so on the world stage, to publicly embrace this murderous tyrant and cast their veto. And then in response, if the touchstone is U.S. national security, we should respond directly with respect to Russia by immediately reinstating the anti-ballistic missile stations in Eastern Europe that at the beginning of the Obama administration they canceled in an effort to appease Russia. And with respect to China, we should immediately approve the sale of F-16s to Taiwan that the administration canceled in order to appease China. Now, these sets of policies all derive from having the objective of defending our national security. If you are focused on U.S. interests, these steps flow naturally. The fundamental failing of this administration's approach to Syria is that it is not focused on U.S. interests. It's focused on defending international norms. And if you don't have an objective, you can't carry it out in a way to ensure that you win, that you satisfy that objective. Let's take Syria's neighbor, Israel. In my view, the United States of America should remain unshakably alongside our vital ally, the nation of Israel. Now, we have right now a strategic partnership with Israel that is often described as aid. I actually think aid is a misnomer for what we're doing with Israel, because it is not, actually, as my national security advisor, Victoria Coates, observed on the car ride over, it is not like sending foodstuffs to Bora Bora. Rather, our aid to Israel is 100% military. And the United States of America gets an enormous dividend from that strategic partnership. We get an enormous dividend from the intelligence, from the resources, from the alliance on the ground, and it is beneficial to the United States of America to have an ally like Israel that is fighting alongside us in such a perilous part of the world where they are surrounded by terrorists who would do us harm and do them harm. And in my view, when the military aid is renegotiated for Israel, we should give serious consideration to substantially increasing the strategic partnership with the nation of Israel, because it is overwhelmingly in the interest of U.S. national security. And you know, one of the places where you can see that interest is if you look at the nation of Iran. In my view, the prospect of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons capacity is the single gravest national security threat to the United States in the entire world. Why is that? Because Iran, by all appearances, is proceeding full speed towards acquiring nuclear weapons capacity, and if they were to do so, there is an unacceptable danger that they would use that nuclear weapons capacity and use those nuclear weapons against the United States or against our allies. You know, Iran has been funding Hezbollah, carrying out terror acts throughout the world. In Bulgaria, murdering 5 Israeli tourists, creating Hezbollah cells in Latin America to advance Iran's interests. And you know, it's interesting watching the media report on Syria, because they tend to think in two-dimensional terms. You're either for military conflict or against military conflict, and you're either for every military conflict or no military conflict. And that makes sense if you're not focused on what the objective is. So there's been lots of talk about now the dove Barack Obama is suddenly a hawk. And with some amusements, journalists write that some of the more hawkish Republicans are suddenly doves. Well, let me tell you, in my view, President Obama is both too hawkish and too dovish at the same time. Why is that? He is too hawkish, too willing to use U.S. military might in defense of international norms in Syria in a way that is not directed at protecting our national security and could well undermine our national security. That is far too hawkish for the commander-in-chief, in my view. And yet, simultaneously, he is far too dovish when it comes to standing up and defending our national security interests. In my opinion, the President of the United States should stand up and say unequivocally, if Iran continues to proceed towards acquiring nuclear weapons capacity, the U.S. will use overwhelming military force to prevent them from acquiring those weapons. In simple, clear, categorical language. You know, one of the ironies is that the softer a leader is when dealing with enemies of the United States, the more likelihood there is for military conflict. One principle from time immemorial is that bullies and tyrants don't respect weakness or appeasement. The Arab world, appeasement only encourages more violence. It was not an accident that the nation of Iran released our hostages after 444 days, the day Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president. I am a big believer in peace through strength. Because of this administration's ambiguous messages on Iran, I think we have increased the likelihood of military conflict with Iran, because those messages can only have been taken by the mullahs as encouragement that the United States, that the president will be less than vigorous protecting our national security. And that if they do proceed, the result might be an unbelievably tiny strike. That encourages military conflict. We need absolute moral clarity. You know, lots of Folks like to say right now that America is war-weary. And listen, I will readily admit I have no desire whatsoever to send our sons and daughters into harm's way. But that message shouldn't be misunderstood. That doesn't mean that America is at all reluctant to protect our vital national security interest. I'll tell you, just last week, I was meeting with soldiers returning from Afghanistan, and another group of soldiers heading to Afghanistan, and the answer every one of them said is, we stand ready to defend this nation against any threat anywhere in the world. If the focus is on defending our national security, we will do what it takes. But we're not willing to sacrifice our sons and daughters in defense of an amorphous international. Now, if you look across the rest of the world, you look at Russia, you look at China. Russia and China are major players, and right now there are many who are embracing Mr. Putin's offer to resolve everything. Now, if the outcome of this offer is Assad giving up his chemical weapons, then that would be a wonderful outcome that we should celebrate, the world should celebrate. It would be good for everybody. But I will confess my attitude towards Russia is very much reminiscent of Reagan's attitude towards the Soviet Union, of trust but verify. If you look at Putin's prior conduct, there is very little reason to have a high level of confidence that this is anything more than a delay tactic or a propaganda tactic. So I encourage the administration to do all we can to use Russia to convince Assad to turn over those chemical weapons. And if it becomes a question of fearing for the survival of the administration, there may be some remote possibility of it happening. But we shouldn't remotely be naive. We shouldn't remotely expect that Russia or China will do anything other than act in their own national interests. And we should understand that you don't deal with nations like Russia and China by embracing arm in arm and singing Kumbaya. The one thing Russia and China understand and respect is strength. Principled strength. And they will act in their own interest, and we may be able to cooperate in specific ways where it is in their interest and our interest to do so. But we shouldn't be for a moment naive that Mr. Putin loves peace and the American way of life. There are additional challenges to consider. We look at our military, the need to modernize our military. I'm going to suggest a simple rule, which is the weapons that our soldiers use should not be older than the young men and women asked to risk their lives using. We should not be asking 20-year-old privates to carry a 30-year-old machine gun into battle in Afghanistan. We should not be asking 30-year-old Air Force pilots providing close air support for that soldier in Afghanistan to fly a 40-year-old A-10 fighter plane. And we shouldn't be asking 40-year-old National Guard pilots of an Air Force refueling tanker that supports the A-10 that was built in the Eisenhower era. We should be providing tools and supporting the men and women of the military so they can carry out their courageous task of defending the United States of America. Related to that is missile defense. You know, missile defense is a principle that is so powerful when you are a lone superpower, when you are dealing with a proliferation of weapons. And as the lone superpower, there are a great many in the world who seek to put targets. And missile defense is the lone technology that provides the potential for real security against rogue nations, against nuclear attack, against chemical attack, against biological attack, against asymmetric attacks that as time goes forward will only become more and more likely. You know, earlier this year I visited Israel twice, late last year and earlier this year. And one of the things that was striking was seeing the results of the Iron Dome missile defense. They had just been the subject of a massive missile assault. And the Iron Dome missile defense had nearly a 90% success rate, knocking out incoming missiles. I have to admit, I was reminded, we just earlier this year had the 30th anniversary of President Reagan's SDI speech. And many of y'all will remember that when President Reagan stood up and argued for Strategic Defense Initiative, it was derided as Star Wars. This is crazy. This is some idea he got out of an old Hollywood movie. In fact, you remember the analogy that they used all the time? This is like trying to hit a bullet with a bullet. Utterly impossible. Don't waste our time. Now, one person who didn't think that was Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev over and over again said, wait, please stop this, because we can't keep up with you technologically on this. Mikhail Gorbachev understood the risks of allowing the United States to protect ourselves. But you know, the success of missile defense in Israel underscores the point I made about the strategic partnership we have there. To have an ally that is live testing in hostile conditions missile defense is extraordinarily beneficial to us. In fact, I would encourage everyone, when you get home tonight, go on your computer and Google Iron Dome wedding. What you will find when you Google that is video from a wedding that was happening in Israel. And it's a wedding video going on, and in the middle of the wedding, you begin to see rockets cutting through the sky at night. And one rocket comes up, and an Iron Dome missile intercepts it. And another rocket comes up, and another Iron Dome, and it proceeds to be like fireworks, lighting up the sky with the wedding music in the background. It really is stunning. Just watch it, and it's real footage from a wedding that occurred. Missile defense is by its nature not aggressive, not offensive, cannot be used to attack anybody. But we should not embrace a pie-in-the-sky view that there are not those who would seek to murder our citizens, and taking every step we can to put in place strong missile defense is overwhelmingly in our national security interest. Finally, I want to talk about U.S. sovereignty. U.S. sovereignty is a deep passion of mine. I know it is a deep passion of the men and women here. Our current ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, has written that the United States should be willing to give up, quote, a pinch of sovereignty. I will confess I am not persuaded. But that does explain the philosophy in Syria of let's go defend international norms rather than the United States of America. And earlier this year, President Obama, in fact, right after he announced his policy to arm the Syrian rebels, he gave a speech in front of the Brandenburg Gate. Actually, ironically enough, on the east side of the Brandenburg Gate. Which I will confess there was a certain fitting irony. But his speech did not mention Syria at all, his decision to start arming the rebels and begin injecting us into that sectarian civil war. But he did say, quote, we embrace the common endeavor of humanity. We are not only citizens of America. We are citizens of the world. And with respect to the Cold War, with respect to the Brandenburg Gate, he said, quote, openness won, tolerance won, and freedom won here in Berlin. Mr. President, with all respect, that's not true. The United States of America won. And it didn't win by accident. It didn't win by failing to stand up for our principles and our values. It won because we had a president who stood and fought for the United States of America. And I'll tell you today, we received on loan from Steve Penley, the wonderful artist, the following painting that is now in my office. This painting is actually ginormous. It's something like 7 feet by 12 feet. It is massive. And it is a painting of President Reagan standing in front of the Brandenburg Gate, uttering the most important words any leader has uttered in modern times, where he stood in front of the Brandenburg Gate and said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Now, we all know when President Reagan gave that speech, over and over again, his speechwriters, the State Department, edited that line out. No, that's too confrontational. You can't tear down the wall. You can't